This video has clearly been made to make a rush ahead of ourselves in this series. It contains a picture of what we'll cover in future videos, some part of which is contained in our book, Historical Past and Future of Christianity. A link to a free download of the digital version of the book is given in the description below. Such abrupt skips and turns will not be uncommon in this series, before picking up on our topical sequence. At the heart of the manifestation of the battle between good and evil upon the earth has been the question of our sinner, born with a hereditary inclination to do evil and with a heart naturally at enmity with God, becomes a saint, reconciled to God both in character and affections. Bible religion has always taught faith as the means by which this transaction is enacted. False religions and all the heathen systems of the world have always favored works as the best means to appease an offended deity. All false religions of the world are made to be a means of escape from some forever burning hell to which an offended deity, who seeks for a legal excuse to do harm to his enemies, delights to banish those who challenge him. Sometimes, because it lacks in essential grace, false religion thrives in promoting a reward system in which one worships God to receive some temporal preferment in this world or to simply go to heaven. Those who thus worship God will normally seek to see the least they can do and still sneak their way out of hell. They will contrive any human machinations to circumvent God's laws, His instructions and provisions in order to ghost into heaven without having to put away sin. But the Bible is not on the side of false religion in any of these notions. Even heaven itself, beautiful as it is as a reward for faithfulness, is not enough incentive for the true Christian to worship God. He worships God because he truly loves and trusts Him. For the just shall live by faith. He is satisfied to be with Jesus anywhere, including in the martyr's burning stake. His heart is melted by an intelligent understanding of the love of God. The love of Christ constrains us, says Paul. Christ's mission to the earth indeed inaugurated a new era. His birth and ministry places themselves historically at the transition between the ancient world and the common era. The Christianity that is set up had the energy, purity, simplicity, and authenticity worthy of its divine source. It moved the world. It changed its history forever. The divine impulse that it breathed into the bosoms of men conducted it threateningly to the very thrones of despots. It threatened to disturb the balance of political power. Monarchs thought that they saw their crowns jostled upon their royal heads. They took alarm. They feared that the righteous and eternal kingdom of Christ had so instantly come upon the ruins of their wicked rule. They hoped this was not so and exerted themselves to preclude the unwelcome possibility. Satan worked upon all that which was excitable about their fears to awaken in them the spirit of intolerance and persecution against the emerging Christianity. It was pagan Rome that then held the sway over the entire civilization. Rome soon set to work to destroy the seed of Jehovah's planting, bend the hand that was stretched out for the salvation of humanity. However, with all its machinery for murder and torture, Christianity only grew stronger and broader. The flames of the persecutor, far from extinguish her, strengthened, purified, and fired her with new zeal and braced her for new exploits. The fact soon undeceived Rome. She discerned the hiding of the Christian's power. She discovered that as long as the church remained true to her principles, she cannot be destroyed. Rome therefore sought a new expedient. Pagan Rome suddenly became Christian. Rome was converted. Her paganism became baptized and Christianized. The pagan feast days, deities, and symbols were transferred to Christianity, with new names and often with new and Christian significances. In the 4th century AD, the day of worship itself was transferred from the Bible Sabbath to Sunday, the venerable day of the sun. This was indeed a novel way to become Christian, an innovative way to convert paganism to Christianity. We will allow that Rome became Christian and henceforward represented what the world then knew as the church. During the Middle Ages, the church believed in salvation by works. There were penances and there were pilgrimages and there were indulgences. Numberless works were introduced into worship to compensate for the sins done in the soul. Compensate, we say, because men greedily indulged in the sins for which they had made due payment by their works of penance and indulgences. The compensations for sin gave their perverted consciences freedom to sin, and men saw no need for conversion. Happily for the carnal heart, impurity ran riot in the Christian world, and the coffers of the church got filled with the gold and silver given out in compensation. Bibles taken aside from the common people and church tradition taught in its place, Christianity matured from its apostolic and primitive form into an embodiment of superstitious and magical practices. Religion degenerated from the rational and graceful impulse that it was in the apostolic days to acts that did violence to reason itself and to every natural light. Not only were living men made to feel the wrath of an offended God, the dead too were to somehow be made to live and feel the penalty of their sins committed in this life. The notion that the souls of the dead somehow are immortal spirits was already a prevalent pagan belief and was always a means by which demonic spirits performed miracles among men. The superstitious credulity of the times easily lent this notion credibility. Purgatory came up. Here, the dead were made to do penance as verily as the living. They had the opportunity to atone for, by personal suffering, the sins they had committed and for which they had had no chance to make sufficient satisfaction in life. Living friends also paid indulgences on behalf of these pitiable souls in limbo. It's self-evident that this was a very generous and useful invention by the Church of the Middle Ages, as it gave a second chance to those pitiable souls who, perhaps because of the pressing commitments of this life, forgot to be Christians while alive. Church tradition then taught, a teaching which the Christian world still endorses, that it is possible for a man to be both dead and alive at the same time. It's called the immortality of the soul. On the premise of this teaching, hell must burn forever, and God, being the unrelenting tyrant that this improved Christianity has made him, will only be appeased by burning immortal souls forever for the sins committed in one short life. Those alone who had the privilege to be canonized by the Pope received admission from purgatory to heaven, which heaven was a rendezvous of floating bodiless spirits. What a pathetic heaven! Some of these spirits had just escaped from the sufferings of purgatory, thanks to the merciful pardons of the Pope, with the curses and swearing they had been uttering there against the hardness of God hardly dry from their lips. About the character that should fit them for the bliss of paradise, no one had told them anything about it. They were saved according to the grace of the Church and in spite of the unrelenting severity of God. Character was unimportant. As to whether these morally and intellectually degraded spirits transferred the quarreling and cursing and blasphemies and all lies into paradise, I leave to the judgment of the listener. Because lacking in the attractions and simplicity of the primitive times, the church at this time spread the gospel and converted sinners, not through the pulpit, but through the scaffold and through the rack and through the stake and through the noose. The hangman's noose and the inquisitor's machete and tweezers spread the gospel faster than the good old Bible. Lacking in the constraining love of Christ, the church had recourse to the compulsion of main force. Torture of heretics was at this time a more pious work than explaining the Bible. To sell indulgences holier than to preach the gospel of free grace. The pious cruelty of soldiers butchering men and sons who were heretical and doing outrage to their wives and daughters was indeed evangelism. For did not many souls get converted to Christ through intimidation and fear? The infamous Inquisition was a powerful tool of the gospel. This was the state of the church, pictured mildly and in slight detail when the Reformation arrived. The church was both rich and powerful when the 16th century was fully come. Leo X had assumed the papal chair in 1513. He had a fine taste for arts and wanted to renovate St. Peter's Church in Rome to make it more worthy of himself. This was an expensive project and there wasn't sufficient money to carry it out. The best project by which to bring this plan to a glad issue would be the sale of more indulgences, seeing there were many sin-sick souls in need of these pardons. More sinners would be forgiven, and the church named after the great apostle would be embellished. Pious expedient. Johann Tetzel, a German Dominican monk, was chosen for this work in Germany. He had the qualifications for this task, and his labors in Germany, the land of Luther, kindled to a fever pitch the simmering energies of the Reformation. At this time, there was already a debate among every class in the society as to how a sinner is brought into harmony with God. Some plainly doubted the efficacy of the Pope's pardons. whether coming through the high road of penances or through the simony of indulgences. Not only did they think unreasonable and inconsistent these means of seeking divine favor, the more conscientious still felt a painful emptiness and guilt in their souls and consciences even after doing penance and purchasing indulgence. Their fears transported them to the bar of the great judge, and their consciences quaked as before a lightning bolt from the skies. They trembled with their securities in hand and would fain flee from their Creator, whose favor they had purchased at the hand of man. This, however, was not all as concerned the difficulty of the church at the time. As if all circumstances had conspired against the great and yet growing strength of the church, the Renaissance had just received a new impulse in the latter part of the previous century from the capture of the classical city of Constantinople by the Saracen hordes. The Greeks fled from this historical city to the west with the language, culture, and literature of antiquity. Thus, the classical tongues and literature in which the sacred writings had been long hidden away were introduced in the West. The spirit of investigation and inquiry into the scriptures was introduced into Western Europe, and with it that of independence of thought. This was the seminal germ of the Reformation. With the study of the sacred writings, many questions and fears rushed into the minds of men as concerns the solidity of the theology of the times. But at the times, these were heretical and therefore very dangerous mental patterns which hardly a man was willing to publicly avow. The renovation of St. Peter's Basilica would supply the man to do the dreaded work, namely, avow his convictions. He was called Luther Martin. We'll briefly meet him shortly. Now Tetzel was traversing Germany with his pardons. No one among the Germans seemed to be as amply qualified as this man for this service to the church. The historian J.H. Melle Diaubin says, if he had the office of a mountebank, he possessed the manners also. Convicted at Innsbruck of adultery and infamous conduct, his vices had nearly cost his death. The Emperor Maximilian had ordered him to be put into a sack and thrown into a river. The Elector Frederick of Saxon interfered and obtained his pardon. It would have been difficult to find in all the convents of Germany a man better qualified than Tetzel for the business with which he was charged. To the theology of a monk, to the zeal and spirit of an inquisitor, he united the greatest effrontery, and the circumstance that most especially facilitated his task was his skill in inventing those extravagant stories by which the people's minds are captivated. To him, all means were good that filled his chest. Raising his voice and displaying the eloquence of a mountebank, he offered his indulgences to all comers, and knew better than any tradesman how to extol his wares. You will find that in Melle's work, History of the Reformation, Book 3, Chapter 1. With a sonorous and powerful voice that conveyed the very alarm, Tetzel went about describing the horrors that friends and relatives were suffering in purgatory. They could easily be forgiven if their relatives could be sensitive enough to place the price of the indulgence into Tetzel's strongbox. Their souls would immediately and happily fly from this limbo into paradise as soon as the silver and the gold went tinkling at the bottom of the chest. The crowds were moved to deep feeling. Money went pouring and souls were released from purgatory to paradise on the part of the dead, and sins of any nature were forgiven among the living. In some cases, however, the guise was penetrated and the sacred fraud searched by the keener, or rather we would say heretical thinkers. J.H. Melle informs us, a Saxon nobleman who had had Tetzel at Leipzig was much displeased by his falsehoods. Approaching the monk, he asked him if he had the power of pardoning sins that men have an intention of committing. Most assuredly, replied Tetzel, I have received full powers from His Holiness for that purpose. Well then, answered the knight, I am desirous of taking a slight revenge on one of my enemies, without endangering his life. I will give you 10 crowns, if you will give me a letter of indulgence that shall fully justify me. Tetzel made some objections. They, however, came to an agreement by the aid of 30 crowns. The monk quitted Leipzig shortly after. The nobleman and his attendants lay in wait for him in a wood between Jüterbock and Treblin. They fell upon him, gave him a slight beating, and took away the well-stored indulgence chest the inquisitor was carrying with him. Tetzel made a violent outcry and carried his complaint before the courts. But the nobleman showed the letter which Tetzel had signed himself and which exempted him beforehand from every penalty. Duke George, whom this action at first had exceedingly exasperated, no sooner read the document than he ordered the accused to be acquitted. This traffic everywhere occupied men's thoughts and was everywhere talked of. It was the topic of conversation in castles, in academies, in the beggars' houses, as well as in taverns, inns, and all places of public resort. Opinions were divided, some believed, others felt indignant. As for the sensible part of the nation, they rejected with disgust the system of indulgences. This doctrine was so opposed to the Holy Scriptures and to morality that every man who had any knowledge of the Bible or any natural light internally condemned it, and only waited for a signal to oppose it. On the other hand, the scoffers found ample food for raillery. The people whom the dissolute lives of the priests had irritated for many years, and whom the fear of punishment still kept within certain bounds, gave vent to all their hatred. Complaints and sarcasms might everywhere be heard on the love of money that devoured the clergy. They did not stop there. They attacked the power of the keys and the authority of the sovereign pontiff. Why, said they, does not the Pope deliver at once all the souls from purgatory by a holy charity and on account of their great wretchedness, since he delivers so many for the love of perishable money and of the Cathedral of St. Peter? Why are they always celebrating festivals and anniversaries for the dead? Why does not the Pope restore or permit the resumption of the benefices and prebends founded in favor of the dead, since it is now useless and even reprehensible to pray for those whom the indulgences have delivered forever? What means this new holiness of God and of the Pope, that for the love of money they grant to an impious man and an enemy of God, to deliver from purgatory a pious soul, the beloved of the Lord, rather than deliver it themselves gratuitously through love and because of its great misery? Martin Luther had struggled for a long while to obtain divine pardon and peaceful conscience through doing penance. His great and conscientious struggles at self-mortification had pushed him to the borders of the grave. Peace of conscience, however, he obtained not. He finally found the Bible, and through the Bible the doctrine of righteousness by faith. He encountered the Lamb of God that taketh away the sins of the world. His life was changed, and with it the history of the world. Tetzel finally found more than a match in the converted Luther. The discovery of this good old book and its essential doctrine sounded the death knell of the papacy and sparked light athwart the darkness and superstition of the Middle Ages. Protestantism was born on the basis of sola scriptura, the Bible and the Bible alone as the basis of faith and doctrine. On the 31st of October 1517, a new world was born when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on the door of the Castle Church of Wittenberg. By this work of mental valor, the decree for the emancipation of the energies of the soul of man to do their divinely appointed office was enunciated. With consciences liberated and minds set free, man could again think and act for himself. Nations themselves were liberated from vassalage to the iron grip of Rome. As the ox leaps in the acorn and the chicken lies dormant in the egg, so did modern science and civilization sleep in the germ of freedom, and modern times wait in the womb of the Protestant Reformation. A completely new society was conceived the day men began to assert their freedom of thought and action. The seas of blood through which Protestantism traveled to modern times we might not find room to detail in this brief teaser, but it's all open to the investigation of all the students of history. We will reproduce the historical picture in greater detail later on in our video series. But because the period of the Reformation was the dawn and not midday of the biblical movement, there were imperfections in the interpretations of the Bible even among the reformers themselves. They themselves confessed that they expected the Lord to reveal more light after them. Unhappily, however, differences in opinions among the reformers created a sectarian spirit which greatly impeded the progress of the Reformation. These divisions would, with good results, have been improved by the after generations in the providence of God to lead to a more diligent study of the scriptures to know the true biblical doctrine. However, the opposite course has been pursued by the Protestantism of our day. Unity has been sought not on the basis of doctrine, but on the basis of compromise. Instead of continuing in the path of the pioneers of the Reformation to rediscover new and unquestionable light from the Bible, the old has been dimmed and nearly put out altogether. Other denominations have been created not to make prominent another biblical principle, but rather to exalt a new preacher. Issues of principle or biblical doctrine have been felt to be unimportant as long as unity can be established. This reasoning has made Protestantism obese rather than strong. The barriers of scriptural principle being torn down, the floodgates have been thrown open for the sweeping errors from beneath. A strong spirit has manifested itself in Protestantism, but not from above. The love of money has pervaded the so-called prophets of the day, and as has always been the case at the commencement of every Reformation, the tables of the money changers of our day have to be turned to begin a genuinely spiritual movement at our time. Jesus turned the tables of the money changers in Jerusalem. Luther overturned the strongbox of Tetzel, and who will break the spell of the downright simony of our day? Christ said concerning his second advent, Elias truly shall first come and restore all things. That is Matthew 17 verse 11. But the love of money is not the only problem of the Protestantism of our day. The apparently charitable work of de-emphasizing doctrine has led Protestantism on to spiritual and moral anarchy. Every uncouth thing has found entrance in the name of the Spirit's working. Salvation by grace, which is the foundational pillar of the biblical movement, has been turned into a license for sin. The Roman system on the one hand teaching salvation by works, and the Protestant system on the other teaching a form of grace which saves man, not from sin, but in sin, both give evidence of what it means to be on the extreme poles across the golden mean. According to Bible prophecy, these opposite poles will draw together, as in the case of electricity and magnetism, in the closing scenes of the Earth's history to form a powerful movement in opposition to biblical morality. This video series will seek to reveal the principles at play in the drama both in history past and future. Besides the purely religious perspective, the series will address itself to the history of the nations, their birth, their real source of strength or weakness, origins and growth of dominating languages and civilizations, origins and growth in science, technology, and government structures. We are also going to treat upon the biblical perspective in human affairs and the real issues at the heart of history. As man was made of matter from beneath and spirit from above, so is his history. To handle the merely dry occurrences of the past is to treat upon lifeless, dull, and dumb matter from beneath. To perceive somewhat of the power and intelligence that overrules among the affairs of men, animating with intelligence, beauty, and instruction all events of the past and the future, is to sit at the place where we are able to sound the pulse and life of human occurrences. It is to sit where also we may and can influence those occurrences. It is thus that men interact with the spirit of history. The spirit of history is also from above, like our breath of life. It quickens dead letters upon the historian's pen and page and voice into living characters that in flaming energy burn upon the minds and consciences of the reader and listener. To study the past well is to place oneself in command of the future. History is the pisgah from which we can at once have a commanding view of the wilderness behind us and the promised land before us.